On a limestone ridge in the mountains of southeastern Turkey, there is something that should not be there. For most of the 20th century, surveys of the area passed over it without a second thought. The ridge was catalogued as a naturally eroded wasteland, broken rock, dust, and the occasional scatter of ancient flint. Nothing worth stopping for. Then Klaus Schmidt arrived, and what looked like nothing turned out to be one of the most consequential finds in the history of human science. What Schmidt uncovered beneath that unremarkable hill was not a settlement, not a burial ground, not a medieval ruin. It was a complex of megalithic enclosures, massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in deliberate rings, set into pedestals cut from living bedrock, decorated with three-dimensional relief carvings of animals so detailed they seem moments away from moving. The scale, the precision, and the craftsmanship were extraordinary by any standard. But the date attached to them was what stopped the scientific world cold. These structures were built before farming, before pottery, before any of the conditions we have always considered necessary for this kind of organized, sustained, technically demanding construction to be possible. The discovery did not adjust our understanding of human prehistory. It broke the framework entirely and demanded that we rebuild it from the ground up. To understand the weight of what was found on that ridge, you have to understand what the textbooks said and how completely the discovery contradicts it. For more than a century, the accepted model of human development followed a clear and logical sequence. Humans spent hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, mobile, small-grouped, technologically basic. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something changed. People in the Fertile Crescent, the region spanning modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, began selectively cultivating wild grasses. Wheat and barley became the first crops. The farm created a food surplus. The surplus allowed people to stay in one place. Permanent settlement led to social hierarchy, specialized labor, and eventually the complex institutions we call civilization. Under this model, monumental architecture was a late product of the sequence, something that became possible only after agriculture had generated the surplus necessary to free large numbers of people from subsistence work. Temples, cities, organized religion, these were the rewards of a full granary, not its cause. A group of nomadic hunters constructing a megalithic complex would have been, by the logic of that model, as plausible as a person constructing a bridge before the concept of engineering existed. The idea was simply outside the range of what was considered possible at that time in human development. That framework was not the product of lazy thinking. It was built on a century of careful excavation, comparative archaeology, and logical inference. It was the best available explanation for a large body of evidence, and it was wrong, or at least radically incomplete. When the carbon dating results from the lowest excavated levels of the site were confirmed, the number that came back was 9,600 BC. That is more than 11,500 years ago. To place that in context, at that moment in history, the woolly mammoth was still alive. Britain was physically connected to continental Europe by a wide land bridge that would not flood for another 2,000 years. The last great ice age had only just loosened its grip on the northern hemisphere. And yet, the people living through that transition were not huddling in skin shelters and chipping flint arrowheads. They were quarrying limestone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, transporting them hundreds of meters across difficult terrain, raising them upright, and setting them into carved stone sockets with a precision that speaks not of experimentation, but of established practice. They were doing all of this roughly 2,000 years before the first domesticated grain crop appears anywhere in the archaeological record. If the accepted sequence places monumental architecture after agriculture, and this site places monumental architecture before it, then one of two things is true. Either the sequence is wrong, or this site is an exception so large it effectively proves there is no sequence. The site contains no permanent houses, no storage pits for grain, no evidence of animal husbandry, no domestic waste of the kind that accumulates wherever people are living settled lives. The people who built these enclosures were hunters. The animal bones found at the site belonged to wild species, gazelle, aurochs, wild boar, not the domesticated livestock that appear at farming settlements. These were people who woke each morning with no guarantee of a meal and they chose to spend their energy moving mountains of stone. The timing of the construction adds another dimension to the anomaly. The date of 9600 BC marks the precise end of a period climatologists call the Younger Dryas, a sudden, violent cold snap that locked the northern hemisphere in a 1200-year freeze before temperatures lurched upward again with equal speed. The world was emerging from one of the most ecologically disruptive periods in recent geological history. Coastlines were shifting, animal populations were collapsing and relocating, the landscape itself was in flux. This is not the kind of environment in which complex, long-term, resource-intensive construction projects typically begin. When the natural world becomes unstable, human populations tend to contract their ambitions and focus on the immediate demands of survival: food, water, warmth, safety. The builders of these stone hills did the opposite. At the precise moment when the world around them was most uncertain, they committed to a project of staggering scope and duration on a high ridge with no permanent water source and no natural shelter. Something was driving them that went beyond the search for food. They were anchoring themselves to something, an idea, a belief, a shared framework of meaning, at exactly the point when everything else was shifting. Conservative engineering estimates suggest that moving a single 10-ton pillar from the nearby quarries to its position in one of the enclosures would require a coordinated workforce of at least 500 people. Moving a 20-ton pillar would require considerably more. Feeding a labor force of that size, sustaining it for the years required to complete each enclosure, and maintaining the logistical network needed to keep workers supplied on a waterless ridge, all of this implies a level of social organization that mainstream archaeology had not placed in human prehistory until several thousand years later. This is not a question of raw physical capability. Humans have always been capable of moving heavy objects with sufficient numbers and coordination. The question is organizational. Who decided what to build? Who directed the work? Who managed the supply of food and water and tools? Who held the knowledge of how to cut a 20-ton block from a limestone face without shattering it, how to shape a T-form pillar to exact dimensions using only stone tools, how to carve a leopard in three-dimensional relief without making a single irreversible mistake? These are specialized skills. They require training, time, and an institutional structure capable of transmitting expertise across generations. They do not emerge spontaneously from a seasonal gathering of nomadic hunters. When you stand inside one of the central enclosures, the first thing that registers is not the size of the pillars, though that is striking, but the precision of the engineering decisions. The central pillars in the primary enclosure are not simply embedded in the earth. They are seated in sockets carved directly into the bedrock of the hill. The builders did not just move heavy objects into position, they integrated those objects into the geological structure of the mountain. This requires surveying, planning, and a design process that extends far beyond anything improvised on the spot. There was a blueprint. It was followed. The floor surfaces of several enclosures present a different kind of anomaly. They are made of a material called terrazzo, a composite produced by burning limestone at temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius for several days, then crushing the result and mixing it with additional aggregate. This is not a process that happens by accident. It requires a purpose-built kiln, a sustained high-temperature fuel source, and knowledge of the chemical transformation taking place. The resulting material is waterproof, durable, and structurally consistent. It looks in function and appearance like a primitive precursor to concrete. The Romans would not use a similar technique at comparable scale for another 9,000 years. The carved reliefs on the pillars tell a related story. Pillar 27 in the primary enclosure features a large predator, widely interpreted as a leopard, carved in high relief on the stone face. This means the surrounding limestone was removed to a depth of several centimeters, leaving the animal's body projecting outward from the surface in 3 dimensions. A single miscalculation with a stone hammer at any point in the process would have destroyed the piece irreparably. The anatomical accuracy, the sense of movement captured in the posture, and the consistency of quality across dozens of similar carvings at multiple sites indicates a tradition of stone craft that had long since passed through its experimental phase. This was not a culture learning to carve. This was a culture executing a mature artistic language. Some of the central pillars stand nearly 6 meters tall and weigh more than 20 tons. The site is on a steep limestone ridge. The quarries where the stone was extracted lie several hundred meters away across broken, uneven terrain. In a world without draft animals, without wheeled vehicles, and without rope and pulley systems, moving these blocks requires solutions that are not obvious and not simple. The standard explanation, ropes and wooden rollers, runs into difficulty the moment you place it against the actual landscape. Rolling a 20-ton slab across level ground is a documented technique. Hauling one up a rocky gradient is a different engineering problem, and one that requires a level of understanding of weight distribution and mechanical leverage that we do not typically associate with this period. In the surrounding plateau, the negative impressions left by extracted pillars are still visible in the bedrock. The quarrying itself was a massive operation, not the opportunistic collection of surface stones, but the systematic mining of a mountain. Some unfinished pillars remain in the quarry, still attached to the parent rock along one face, abandoned mid-process. One of these is nearly 7.5 meters long, larger than any of the erected pillars in the enclosures. The decision to leave it suggests either that the builders encountered a structural flaw in the stone, or that they reached a physical limit beyond which their techniques could not reliably go. Either interpretation implies that they understood those limits, that they were working to the edge of a defined capability, not wandering blindly through a process they had not mapped. In almost every other archaeological site on record, the physical evidence follows a predictable pattern. The oldest material at the bottom is the roughest, and quality improves as you move upward through the layers, reflecting the accumulation of skill and experience over time. The stone hills invert this completely. The deepest and oldest enclosures, the ones designated layer 3rd, contain the largest pillars, the most sophisticated carvings, and the finest masonry. As excavation moves upward into later construction phases, the quality declines. The pillars in the younger enclosures are smaller. The enclosure plans become simpler and more rectangular. The relief carvings flatten from three-dimensional sculpture into two-dimensional incision. The builders were not improving, they were losing ground. When the most technically accomplished work sits at the bottom of the stratigraphic record, and the most recent work is the crudest, it raises a question the standard model has no comfortable answer for. Where did the original level of skill come from? The quality of the earliest enclosures implies a tradition of stone masonry that took generations, possibly centuries, to develop. But there is no site, anywhere, that shows the developmental stages of that tradition. We do not find the rough early attempts that would have preceded this level of precision. We find only the finished product already at its peak, already declining. The stone hills appear to represent not the birth of something new, but the final expression of something much older. A knowledge tradition arriving at this ridge already formed, already mature, and then gradually losing the capacity to maintain its own standards over the following 2,000 years. The orientation of the central pillars in several of the enclosures has attracted sustained attention from researchers studying the site's astronomical relationships. Analysis of the pillar axes suggests alignments with specific rising and setting positions of major stars and constellations, among them Sirius and the grouping known as Orion. The mathematical probability that multiple pillars across multiple enclosures would align with significant celestial events purely by chance is low enough to warrant serious consideration. If the enclosures functioned in part as observational instruments, fixed points from which specific celestial events could be tracked and recorded, then the builders possessed a working knowledge of astronomy that required years of systematic observation to develop. They were not just engineers and carvers. They were people who mapped the sky and built that map into stone. For the first decade after its discovery, the site was widely treated as an isolated phenomenon, a singular achievement by an anomalous group that had somehow produced something unprecedented and then disappeared. That interpretation became untenable in 2021 with the formal announcement of the Taş Tepeler project, a comprehensive regional archaeological survey that revealed the stone hills were not one site. They were at least 12, scattered across the Harran Plain in a pattern that suggests not independent invention at each location, but a coordinated regional effort operating under a unified architectural and symbolic vocabulary. Sites at Karahan Tepe, Habetsuvan and Şeytan Deresi, among others, confirmed that the T-shaped pillar, the semi-subterranean enclosure, the high-relief animal carving, and the bedrock integrated foundation were not local innovations. They were the shared language of an entire regional culture, one that operated across hundreds of square miles, apparently moving people and materials between sites with a logistical efficiency that implies territorial organization, recognized authority, and sustained communication networks. We are not looking at one exceptional site. We are looking at the heartland of a pre-agricultural civilization. Karahan Tepe, located roughly 35 kilometers east of the primary site, demonstrates that the architectural tradition was both consistent and evolving. The same T-shaped pillars appear here, but the spatial design takes a more deliberate, experiential form. A specialized chamber carved into the bedrock, a room unlike anything found at the main site, contains 11 standing pillars arranged around a central, larger stone. The pillars in this chamber are shaped in a form that leaves little ambiguity about their intended symbolism. The chamber was designed to generate a specific psychological effect in the people who entered it. The approach to the ritual chambers at Karahan Tepe is itself significant. The architecture channels movement, deliberate narrowings in the stone force visitors to compress their path, creating a processional sequence that controls both physical direction and psychological state before the interior is reached. You were not simply admitted to these spaces, you were prepared for them. The chamber floor includes a carved channel, suggesting that liquid, water or something else, was part of the ritual activity conducted inside. The people who designed this space understood the mechanics of atmosphere, how architecture shapes experience, how the built environment can make the human body feel observed, reduced, and subject to something larger than itself. They were doing this 10,000 years before the great cathedrals of Europe deployed the same principles in stone. In 2021, excavations at a third site produced an image that changed the character of the entire discussion. On the back wall of a communal building, carved into the limestone in high relief and dated to approximately 9000 BC, is a sequence of figures interacting across a single carved surface. A central male human figure stands flanked by two leopards, facing outward with open mouths. To one side of this grouping, a second scene shows a man positioned directly in front of a bull, with its horns forward. The figures are not isolated symbols. They are in relationship with each other across the stone, a sequence of events frozen in rock. This is narrative, not decorative pattern, not isolated iconography, but a scene with spatial and temporal logic, figures acting, reacting, facing consequences. The central figure is rendered in high relief, the depth of the surrounding stone removed to make him project outward, giving him physical presence in the space. The leopards are anatomically accurate, their body language conveying threat and momentum. The use of the stone's three-dimensional depth to imply perspective and layered space suggests an artistic tradition that had been developing, refining, and transmitting its techniques for a very long time before this image was made. A cinematic narrative sequence carved in stone 9,000 years before the written word. What does it suggest about the complexity of the belief system being recorded, and how much of that system remains completely invisible to us? When the imagery from all 12 known sites is mapped against each other, a consistent symbolic language emerges. The T-pillar, as a representation of a human or divine figure, specific animals, leopards, vultures, foxes, aurochs, carrying meanings that recur across sites and across centuries, the male human form as a recurring protagonist. These were not decorative choices. They were a mythology recorded in the most permanent medium available, distributed across an entire region, maintained with consistency across thousands of years. The people of the Stone Hills were not writing, but they were recording. The practical question behind all of this is the one that most directly challenges the standard model. How were the builders fed? Tens of thousands of animal bones recovered from the site, primarily gazelle, auroch and wild boar, indicate that the food supply was entirely dependent on hunting. This was not casual subsistence. The volume of meat required to sustain a workforce of several hundred to several thousand people on an ongoing basis implies a level of hunting organization that functioned more like a military supply operation than a foraging strategy. Large-scale coordinated drives, using knowledge of animal migration routes and terrain features to funnel herds into kill zones, would have been necessary to generate the surplus required. What this means is that the complex social organization we associate with agricultural civilizations, the hierarchy, the specialization, the logistical planning, the coordination across large groups, was already present in a hunting society. The farm did not create organized civilization. Organized civilization existed before the farm. The builders of the stone hills demonstrated that a shared purpose, held with sufficient intensity across a large enough population, can produce the same institutional complexity that we assumed only agriculture could generate. Ideology, it turns out, is as powerful an organizing force as a grain surplus. The degradation of quality in the upper stratigraphic layers of the site takes on a different significance when placed against everything else the site reveals. A culture that begins with the highest level of technical achievement and then slowly loses it over 2,000 years is not a culture that is inventing something. It is a culture that is preserving something, or trying to, and gradually failing. The knowledge required to produce the deepest enclosures was already fully formed when construction began. It did not develop here. It arrived here. If the skill demonstrated in the oldest layers was not developed at this site, then it was brought here from somewhere else, from a tradition with a history long enough to produce it. That tradition has not yet been found. The possibility that the stone hills represent a late-stage expression of a knowledge tradition whose origins lie even further back in time, perhaps in the period before the Younger Dryas, perhaps in cultures that have left no physical trace accessible to current archaeology, is not a comfortable hypothesis. It requires accepting that our map of human prehistory has significant blank spaces that we have not yet recognized as blank. But the physical evidence at the site does not offer an easier alternative. The regression of skill in the upper layers, combined with the absence of any developmental record in the lower ones, points in one direction. These builders were not at the beginning of something. They were near the end of it. The final act at the stone hills is perhaps the most deliberately puzzling of all. The enclosures were not abandoned. They were not destroyed by invaders or collapsed by seismic events. They were buried, methodically, intentionally, and with what appears to have been enormous effort and care. Hundreds of tons of material, clean limestone rubble, worked stone fragments, animal bone, were brought to the site and used to fill the enclosures from floor level upward, sealing the pillars inside artificial hills. The volume of this backfill represents a construction project almost as demanding as the original building. Someone chose to do this. Someone organized the labor, directed the process, and saw it through to completion. The material used for the burial was not random debris. It was selected, clean, relatively uniform, deliberately placed rather than simply dumped. This was not the erasure of a site that had lost its meaning, it was the preservation of one. The enclosures were sealed against the elements, against intrusion, against time. Whatever existed inside them was being protected, not discarded. The choice of how to bury these structures suggests that the people doing the burying understood their value and believed or hoped that someone would eventually find them. The question of why they did it remains genuinely open. Some researchers read it as a ritual retirement, the formal conclusion of a sacred cycle in which the old enclosures were closed to allow new ones to be built. Others suggest the burial was a response to some external pressure, a changing political landscape, a perceived threat, a world that had shifted in ways that made the open use of these spaces no longer possible or appropriate. What the burial definitively demonstrates is that the people who carried it out had a long enough institutional memory to remember what the enclosures meant and cared enough about that meaning to invest massively in its protection. They were not fleeing, they were making a decision about the future. By filling the enclosures with clean fill and walking away, The builders of the stone hills ensured one outcome with certainty. Whatever was inside would survive. The pillars, the floors, the carved reliefs, the careful architectural proportions, all of it would remain sealed and undisturbed through the following 10.5 millennia, waiting in absolute darkness beneath the hill that had by then become indistinguishable from any other piece of eroded limestone terrain. Waiting, in effect, for someone to notice that the hill was wrong. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt noticed. What he found when he pulled back the earth was not the beginning of human civilization as we understood it. It was something stranger, and in some ways, more troubling than that. It was evidence that the story we have been telling about ourselves, linear, progressive, starting from primitive and arriving at complex, may be missing a chapter, or more than one. The stone hills did not answer the question of where organized human society begins. They pushed that question further back into a darkness we have not yet found a way to illuminate. And they will keep raising it, with the patience of things that have already waited 11,000 years, for as long as it takes us to ask it correctly.